Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the closing keynote of the 2021 Smart Start Conference. My name is Amy Cubbage, President of the North Carolina Partnership for Children. It has been a great week of learning, with more than 700 of us coming together to learn and grow and ultimately better serve children and families. I've been looking forward to this keynote all week. In fact, I've been anticipating it for many months. As I reflected on how to introduce this conversation to you, one of Dr. Kendi's quotes stuck with me. Once we lose hope, we are guaranteed to lose. But if we ignore the odds and fight to create an anti-racist world, then we give humanity a chance to one day survive, a chance to live in communion, a chance to be forever free. Like most of you, I have worked my entire career in early childhood, focused on the hope and opportunity that our youngest children represent. The window of great opportunity in a young child's life fuels our passion and drives our sense of urgency. And as we undertake that work, we cannot ignore the long-standing and continuing effects of racism. At Smart Start, as we seek to reach each child in every community, we know that our mission compels us to center our work on equity. We know that early childhood investments can build equity by removing barriers to success, empowering children and families, and inspiring a more just society. But we know also that it's not enough to observe the national conversation on racism, that we must adopt anti-racist policies to truly serve every child and to change the early childhood sector for the better. And that process starts with each one of us, confronting our own racism and educating ourselves and challenging our systems to change. Today's conversation with Dr. Kendi is another powerful step on that journey of our learning, of our work, and of our action. Dr. Ibram X Kendi is a National Book Award winning and #1 New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, including How to Be an Anti-Racist. Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities and the founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. As a proud alumna of Boston University's Wheelock College, I am so proud that you are continuing your work there, Dr. Kendi. Dr. Kendi is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News racial justice contributor. He is the host of the new podcast, Be Anti-Racist with Ibram X Kendi, that's launching on June 9th. In 2020, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Dr. Kendi is also a father, so he brings that important perspective to our conversation as well. And Dr. Kendi now will lead us through a conversation today around race and racial justice. And this discussion will be led by my good friend and colleague, Safiyah Jackson, the Chief Strategy Officer at the North Carolina Partnership for Children. Many of you know Sophia, her energy, her commitment to improving the lives of children, their families, and their teachers. She is an accomplished nonprofit leader, child advocate, and one who has worked as an early learning educator, a school psychologist, and a professional trainer. Sophia holds an MBA from Florida A&M University and MED degrees in both early childhood and school psychology from National Louis University. She is a powerful force for change at Smart Start and across the early childhood field. Together, Dr. Kendi and Sophia will lead us and help us navigate racism, its impact on society, and the early childhood sector. They will help each of us identify the ways we can create a better early childhood sector in which every child can thrive. Let us all now give a warm welcome to Dr. Kendi and Safiyah Jackson as they lead us on this powerful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that warm welcome. Dr. Ibram X Kendi, I am honored to be here with you today. In 2019, when I read your title, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, I was intrigued. I remember thinking, but there's so many. How could it be captured in one book? Yet when I finished, I knew that we all needed what you offered. Since then, your message of anti-racism has taken hold in our current dialogues. So thank you. Thank you for advancing such an important call to action and for offering such a deep historical account of the ideas that underpin our current reality. And what a day. For the next hour, we get to explore the intersection of the two most important topics in the world: how the earliest days of a child's life shapes lifelong opportunities, and how anti-racist policies can restore the opportunities that racism has stolen since America's earliest days. On behalf of all the Birth to Five champions on the call, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Dr. Kendi, for helping us stretch our thinking about how the early childhood field can help create an anti-racist world. So let's dig in. I've got a couple questions for you. And I'll start with this one. We've all heard the term, "I'm not a racist." Your response would be, well, there's no such thing as not racist. Instead, there's either racist or anti-racist. Help us to understand the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist.
Sure. First, Sophia, I'm glad we're able to have this conversation, and I want to thank Amy for that introduction. We're trying to still do it big up here at BU. So I think that it is important for us to first recognize the distinction between racist and anti-racist, which then allows us to see that there's really no place for not racist. It's a term without a definition, or I should say, it's a term without meaning. And so if a racist idea connotes racial hierarchy, that certain groups are behaviorally or culturally or biologically superior, or certain racial groups are inferior, or this is what's wrong with Black people or Latinx people, then anti-racist ideas connote the very opposite, which is racial equality, which is that there's nothing wrong or right, superior or inferior about any racial group. If a racist policy is any measure that is leading to racial inequity between groups, the inequity of Black girls being more likely to be suspended in preschool than white girls, then the opposite of that is our policies, our anti-racist policies that lead to equity and justice between racial groups. And so when you think about it in that way, you then look at individuals and you see individuals who are either expressing racist or anti-racist ideas, supporting racist or anti-racist policies. And when we're expressing a racist idea or supporting a racist policy, we're being racist. When we are supporting an anti-racist policy or expressing an anti-racist idea, we're being anti-racist. Now, and I think, but it's important to understand it at a structural level that, a powerful collection of policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by ideas of racial hierarchy is racism. And what's the opposite of that? A powerful collection of policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by ideas of racial equality. Now, unfortunately, when you have individuals upholding racism or expressing racist ideas or policies, and we call them out, what do they say? They say, no, I'm not racist. And that's pretty much the standard, as opposed to be anti-racist is to reflect, is to admit, is to recognize those times in which we're being racist, because that acknowledgement is the door to being anti-racist.
Yes. What you're describing is a pretty significant mindset shift. And in your book, How to Be a Racist, you invited us into your life story and traced the evolution of your own thinking about race, thus inspiring us to think about how our own journey with race and mindset shifts can take place. What would you offer as some of the steps that we can take as individuals to begin recognizing this very important shift and thinking around anti-racism and how it is explicitly eliminating racial inequity?
I think for me, I think two huge shifts were critical. First was the recognition based on the evidence that for too long we had been conceiving of racist, like not racist, as who a person is, as a person's identity, that that is in someone's heart or bones, that in a way to call someone racist is to tattoo the term racist on their forehead, on their arm. It's going to be permanent. That's who they are. And obviously the response to that is, no, I'm not racist. And people tattoo not racist on their forehead. So no matter what I do, no matter what I say, I'm not racist. That does not take into account people, potentially the majority of people, who express racist and anti-racist ideas in different moments, who, when it comes to early childhood education, they could support anti-racist policies, but then when it comes to healthcare, they could support racist policies. They could see health inequities as the result of the behavioral inferiority of Black people, which is a racist perspective. But then when they look out at specific health disparities like COVID-19, they're like, oh, that's the result of systemic racism. So how do you account for that person? How do you describe that person as essentially racist or anti-racist? You can't, but what you can say is when that person is expressing racist ideas, they're being racist. When that person is supporting anti-racist policies, they're being anti-racist. The reason why that's critical is because then it allows us to see the term racist and anti-racist instead of as tattoos, as almost like peelable name tags. So what are you doing? What are you doing in every moment? That's going to then, determine what, or allow us to describe what you're being. So then that allows a person who just said a racist idea to take off that name tag by admitting it, by acknowledging it, and be anti-racist in trying to repair from it. So I think that frees people up to transform themselves, just as I think it frees people up to transform society. And secondly, I'll say that the way in which we go about transforming ourselves and transforming our society is having a very clear and consistent sense of what is a racist idea and what is a racist policy and what is racism, especially in this moment where you have so many people trying to convince us that this nation of racial inequities and disparities and injustices is, quote, not racist.
That's pretty powerful. So the idea that being an anti-racist is a moment-by-moment decision. I like that. It is not a tattoo. It's a peelable sticker, name tag that can be put on and put off in any moment, in any conversation. So that really requires a lot of reflective approaches to our engagements. How can we be attuned to that kind of reflection? In your conversation over the years, how have you been able to encourage folks to pause for that moment of reflection to identify whether they're being racist or anti-racist in a given moment?
What I've tried to articulate and remember myself, that if the heartbeat of being racist is denial, is consistently and regularly saying, I'm not racist, this nation is not racist. That policy that's harming children of color is not racist. That idea that is demeaning Asian children is not racist. Then what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is acknowledgement, is confession. So really this sort of guiding light that the heartbeat of being anti-racist is confession. And so if you understand it as such, you have to constantly reflect on what you're doing and what you're saying, because you want to be anti-racist. So you want to admit and acknowledge those times in which we're being racist based on whatever we're saying or the policies that we're supporting. And what that means is not just at a personal level, it's admitting when our institutions, when our policies, when our communities, when our nations, when the practices that we're following that are harming people are racist too. That's the only way in which we're going to change them.
Yeah. I'm excited to get into some of those policies in just a moment. But in your book, Stamped from the Beginning, and the recent youth version of that, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the baby companion to that, you teach many lessons about race. What lessons do you think we should take away that is specific to early childhood development and early racial identity?
There's so many, but I would probably say at the top is that to recognize that unfortunately our children are coming into this world in a dangerously are coming into a dangerously racist society. And so instead of us framing certain groups, Black people, Black neighborhoods, 4-year-old Black girls as dangerous, we should be framing and recognizing our society, our community, as dangerously racist. What makes it dangerously racist, especially for the youngest of people? Because like with other sort of issues, when you come into a society where you're 2 or 3 years old and you're hearing and seeing people directly and indirectly telling you that dark is ugly, how would you know to protect yourself if you're a darker child against that idea? If you're constantly being told directly and indirectly that light is beautiful, how do you as a lighter child protect yourself against that idea? And I say protect yourself because just as a child internalizing the idea that there's something wrong with her skin color, it will lead to self-esteem issues. So too, a child thinking that there's something right about him because of his skin color is going to lead to levels of conceit that is also going to be problematic. And how, what are we teaching? 4-year-olds can see inequality. They can see that certain racial groups have more and other racial groups have less. And what explanation are we providing them for why that's happening? And what do you think they're going to assume as to why that's happening if we don't explain to them rules and bad rules? Like that rule, your bedtime, the one you hate the most. But what are they going to assume? They're going to assume people have less because they are less, especially in a smog of racist ideas, that is saying that. And so I don't think people realize how dangerously racist our society, even if you take a homogenous white neighborhood, a neighborhood that's 3/4 white, 80% white, and the vast majority of white people in this country live in those types of neighborhoods. Studies show that those neighborhoods are dangerous for white children. Studies show that as early as 3 to 9 months, children of all races start seeing race And studies show that children who grow up in homogeneous neighborhoods are more likely during the 3 to 9 month stage to prefer and be attracted to same race faces. In other words, a white baby would prefer a white, face. But those who are growing up in more heterogeneous neighborhoods, we don't see that level of preference. And so, but so many white caretakers view those homogeneous white neighborhoods as good neighborhoods for their children. When again, studies show that that's not the case, and it's the same thing in schools. But let me stop there because I could probably go on.
Well, yes. Well, thank you for bringing this important message. I welcome if you have any additional thoughts to add on that, because it's such a critical point to make. Thinking about those first initial months of life, everyone on this call, we're birth to 5 champions. So we know how important those early days are, but all too often there aren't enough conversations about the intersection of race.
Yeah, I was just going to add that as it relates to schools, studies consistently show that, if we're continuing to talk about white students, white children, that white children who grow up, I should say, who go to school in heterogeneous, diverse schools, are more likely to acquire a host of skills that are important for them to be productive citizens and even be, quote, successful and make a ton of money, whether you're talking about critical thinking skills, problem solving skills. Studies show that there isn't a decline in, quote, standardized test scores for white children who go to diverse schools. So, and then of course, that's not to mention intercultural skills. But I think going back to children of all races, studies show as early as 2 to 3 years old, our kids are discerning who to play with based on skin color, in the way adults discern who's dangerous based on skin color. All the while, their parents and caretakers are like, oh, they're too young to understand race or, to make those types of decisions when they're understanding race as a concept as early as 3 months. When they're making those types of decisions as early as 2 to 3 years old. And just like in general, especially the folks on this call know how critical those first 5 years are for every single sort of intellectual or conceptual or physical sort of measure. It's the same thing as it relates to race.
Yeah, yes. So we know, as you've gotten us thinking already, that racism yields a number of racial inequities, and it permeates every sector of our private and public lives. For our field, just to name a few, there are disparities in infant mortality, disparities in childhood healthy weight, preschool expulsion and suspension. What are some of the anti-racist policies that you find would have the greatest impact on families with young children?
Wow. So where do we begin? So if we take sort of disparities in infant mortality, we have a nation where the families and the mothers with the least amount of resources and the most amount of sort of physical problems during pregnancy are typically giving birth at the hospitals with the least amount of resources. And so as it relates to an anti-racist policy, and this certainly would not only be beneficial to Black women who studies show are indeed coming from families with the least amount of resources, but during the course of pregnancy, they face the most challenges, but then are typically giving birth in the hospitals with the least amount of the least amount of resources and high quality care. You're waiting on problems, right? It would be the inverse. Those mothers, those families of all races and backgrounds, who have the least amount of resources, who have the most amount of difficulties during pregnancy, would be getting prenatal care, would be providing, would be delivering their babies, at the best hospitals. And how do we make that happen? I think obviously one of the reasons why Black women, some studies show, have more struggles during pregnancy and even more struggles after pregnancy is because they're simply less likely to be insured. And so you're less likely to be insured. You're less likely to get prenatal care. And you're also more likely to get kicked off your insurance after you give birth. And so, you may not have a fatal event at birth, but those fatal events happen, weeks or months after birth, and you're not in a place in which you can protect yourself. So obviously a Medicare for all plan, or some sort of plan that allows for every single person to have access to care, would be critical. But then of course, high quality care, is absolutely, critical as well. And then, as it relates to school suspensions, I think it's part of a larger problem in which, in our society, and especially in our society's treatment of Black children and children of color, we live in a carceral state. We live in a policed state. We live in a nation where the other day, a 3-month-old baby was shot and killed by the police. And we live in a state in which it's normal and regular to suspend 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds. I mean, it's just, it is inconceivable, right, to imagine that we need to suspend 3 and 4-year-olds, right? But that's normal. And part of the reason why Black girls in particular and Black boys are more likely to be suspended is because of a larger problem that in many ways Black children are treated like adults and Black adults are treated like children.
Yeah, I've heard the first part of that statement before. Black children, and then the research around Black girls and boys treated as adults. But yes, Black adults treated as children. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, as you know, Sophia, there's a very, very long history of grown Black people being called boys and girls. There's a very long history of, let's say Black women speaking out at their workplaces about sexism and racism, and then being perceived as emotional, like teenage girls who can't control themselves. There's a very sort of long history of people, particularly of white Americans, feeling as if they have to save people of color. And who do we view having to save or having to nurture or having to raise? Children. We don't imagine that all adults, Black adults, need or resources and opportunities. No, we're like, you know what? They need to be nurtured. They need to be civilized. They need to be developed.
Yes. Thank you for taking us down this road. Within the Smart Start Network, we support the environments where children are growing and developing. And we also support the parents and the adults in their lives through home visiting and parenting education programs. So this idea of how adults are treated like children really completes the full circle of our thinking and aligns with our comprehensive approach. So I really appreciate that. Throughout our history in America, we have seen both racial progress and racist progress. How do we talk about race acknowledging that tension and acknowledging the resistance while moving forward together.
So to me, it's just, I think we have to move past sort of treating this nation almost like it's our favorite sports team, in which we're just going to root for it and blindly say it's the best, even if it's not making the playoffs, even if it's one of the worst teams in NBA. And I say this as a long-suffering New York Knicks fan, who for years, we were like the worst team in the NBA, but I was still like, oh yeah, we're the best. And people thought I was crazy. I had no data to actually back that up. I just had this blind allegiance. But what it resulted in was this consistent mediocrity. Because if you conceive of yourself, or if you conceive of your team, or you conceive of your nation as one of the best, but when we look at it empirically, there are more women dying in pregnancy in the United States than every other wealthy country in the world. Infant mortality rates in the United States compare more so with poorer countries than wealthy countries. The lack of funding for particularly preschool children, is appalling when compared to the rest of the world. When you actually look at the data, you actually see that indeed the nation is not the best. So then, or the nation is not exceptional. So then it allows you to say, okay, what is great about the nation and what is not great? And then when you're able to see that, you're able to fix the problems. And so indeed, I think that then allows us to say, it is the case that 50 years ago, the idea of Black, and white preschool children going to school together was anathema, didn't really happen. And so the fact that happens now is certainly progress. But at the same time, then those Black children were almost totally being taught by Black teachers. And now upwards of 80% of the national teaching population, are white women. And you see these disparities, I should say, you see the distinctions in which typically, according to data, Black teachers are having higher expectations for Black children, which is then leading to higher outcomes for those Black children when compared to white teachers. And you see these disparities in expulsion rates. And so in other words, we're looking at the problems while also acknowledging the progress that we've made. But I think it's important for us to know that the problems, these inequities, are not by happenstance. They're the result of powerful forces defending or instituting old or new policies that maintain these racial inequities. So that's why and these inequities, I should say, the policies and practices have become more sophisticated, over time, which of course, that's why that is why, in a way, I call it racist progress.
Yeah. I want to stay here for a little bit, because essentially this task, this call to action is to operate within a set of policies and infrastructure that was born out of racist ideas, while trying to move and shift it toward anti-racist ideas. That is a tension that has always been and will be. But what kind of advice do you have for us really navigating that tension? Because some people will say we need to just burn it down, stop, and rebuild from a different place. But practically, that's not really possible. So what's your perspective, and how do you respond to that tension?
So what's fascinating is, on some level, both perspectives are correct. And what's ironic is, typically when we're arguing our friends and we're both correct, that's why we can never, no, neither person lets it down.
Yeah.
The way in which they're both correct is because I think it's important for us to understand a structure as like what is a structure made up of? A structure, particularly the structure of racism, is made up of policies, practices, ideas, and certainly power. And so when you think of power, you're talking about policymakers, you're talking about people with massive platforms who are producing and mass circulating ideas. And so when you actually understand all of the elements of the structure, and you also understand that they're bigger bones. In other words, there are massive bones and then there's smaller bones, like in the human body. I think it allows us to figure out, okay, like, what are those bigger bones? What are those bigger policies, within this larger structure that we can break and transform? And once we transform enough of those bones, particularly the biggest bones, something as simple as, universal free preschool for all children, that's a massive bone. That begins the process of revolutionizing the entire structure.
Yeah. So this is so fascinating. Thank you for your thoughts here. My colleagues, since I've started at North Carolina Partnership for Children, have been leading a number of book clubs, and we've been learning and growing as an organization, which means we're having lots of conversations about race and racism and anti-racism. What advice do you have for starting the conversation on race? Because in order to get to the big bones, the minor bones, and a lot of what we've been talking about, it has to start somewhere. What advice do you have for just opening up that conversation?
So to me, I would open up that conversation with people by asking a group of people to collectively or individually define terms. So you can start with any of these terms we've been talking about, taking a group of people or that individual and asking them, how do you define a racist idea? And allowing that individual to come up with a definition that can be put in the dictionary and apply to all racial ideas. Or working with that group to do so. The reason why starting with definitions are so critical is because oftentimes most people who claim the nation that systemic racism doesn't exist or they are not racist cannot define systemic racism, do not have a clear definition of, let's say, the term racist. They just know they're not it. And so when you encourage people to define terms, that almost brings them back into reality from this sort of space of denial. Because then once you define those terms, you then, of course, have to apply those terms to yourself, to your society. And that's why in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I anchored every chapter with different definitions that can then guide those chapters in this larger conversation.
Okay, I'd like to give you 2 words and hear your definition of them, because they're words that we use often across our network and across our organization. The first is white supremacy culture. How do we define that?
Wow. So white so it's not a term that I necessarily use, but when people use that term, from my understanding, what they're saying is they're either saying one or two things. They're stating that that the cultures of white people, their ways of life, their ways of being, are not only are supreme within a particular space, and thereby the cultures of other peoples of color are being discarded, demeaned. People are being demanded or asked to assimilate, into the supreme white culture. The other way in which it's used, potentially more than that first sort of definition, is to essentially state that an institution is governed by notions, not only notions of white supremacy, but the politics of white supremacy. That literally white people are in power and imposing that power, onto people of color, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all the people in positions of power are white. But what that means is the interests of white people and the cultures of white people, are running supreme, within that organization.
Awesome. And just a quick follow-up. Is there a different term that you would sort of use to replace white supremacy culture?
Racism.
Okay, all right, let's get straight to it. I want to welcome our audience members to, I haven't been following the chat, but my colleagues on the line have been following the chat, and welcome any questions from the audience in the chat. Before I give you the second word, I just want to check in to see if we have any questions here. Let's see, I think I see. Oh, well, I just asked the question that was in the chat, why you choose not to use the term white supremacy culture. Well, that's a little bit different. I asked you what you would replace it with. So in the spirit of this question, why do you choose not to use the term white supremacy culture?
Or because, so when I think of white supremacy, I'm thinking of a political phenomenon. And so if you sort of, the three main sort of elements of, or I should say outgrowths of sort of a pro-white racism. One is white people being politically supreme and essentially having political power and dominion over people of color. Secondly, white people having economic power through racial capitalism. And thirdly, and obviously a racial wealth gap existing. And thirdly, the cultures of white people being the standard and thereby dominant. And so I'm always trying to think about making sure people are recognizing the interlocking nature of economic power, political power, and cultural power. And so for me, white supremacist culture, for some people, confuses that. And so for me, I'm always about, does a person know exactly what I'm saying when I use a term?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And like you said earlier, racist just gets right to it, but some people don't know what that is.
Exactly.
Either. I think there are other questions here. Let's see. All right. So there's a question. Oh, let me give you my other word first, because the questions are coming up first. The other word I'm interested in your definition is system building, systems change.
Systems change. That's simple for me. Transforming power and policy.
Power in policy. Yes, very straightforward. Here's a question from the audience. What are some suggestions for when I, as a white man, am talking to someone in private who is acting hateful, but confident and firm in their thinking?
Again, it really depends on, so let's say, for instance, somebody just says, yeah, that Black man should have been killed, by the police. You could respond by asking the person, by stating that, Black people are actually more likely to be killed by the police than white people. Why do you think that's the case? And then when they state that, well, it's because Black people are so irresponsible, you can then ask them, well, how do you define a racist idea? And you should not move from that. You should, get them to define a racist idea. And then you return back to that statement. Why is it that Black people are more likely to be killed by the police than white people? And then if they've defined a racist idea in any way close to the way it should be defined, which is any concept that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way, and when they then reiterate that it's because there's something wrong with Black people, that Black people are dying at higher rates, you can actually state that based on their definition, they're expressing a racist idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a question that I was going to ask you beyond showing the data of disparities and the outcomes of various policies. How do we help others reflect and expand their learning? And what I'm hearing you're saying is lead with these questions. When the data is there and folks still don't want to see the data, really asking them to maybe offer an explanation for that data. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, and that is more of a casual acquaintance. I think if it's somebody we're close to, I think the approach should be a little bit different. I think if it's somebody we're close to, we really need to build that person's trust over time, and then also really figure out what is addicting them to, let's say, racist ideas, and understanding almost being racist as like an addiction. And so you're just not going to, a person who has any addiction is going to deny that they have that addiction. And they're going to have to realize that they have that addiction for themselves in order to change. And so then what's critical, as addiction studies points to, in allowing a person to see that, is supporting a person, is that social sort of support, particularly trusting support. And so that's why the whole trust and building the relationship and really trying to get them to really trying to figure out what is addicting them to racist ideas, and then potentially replacing that story, because it's typically some sort of story that is likely not true about a particular racial group. And it's typically personal to them. You know what, I had a job, and I think once you get to the root of that story, then you're able to potentially begin the process of replacing it, which can then help them free themselves of that addiction.
Mm-hmm. I really enjoy your metaphors in your answers. They really help with understanding. Here's another question. Do you feel that people of color have to assimilate in order to participate and be part of economic success in America?
So it is, I think we don't have any data that necessarily proves this, but anecdotally, I think people of color are more or less taught that if you assimilate, then you will potentially have more economic opportunity. and thereby you have more economic opportunity. You'll, like any other group, more times than not, quote, do better economically. The reason why I say we don't have any data on this is because, so let's take a writer. You know, if a writer decides, I'm going to write and change myself and change what I want to say to make it palatable to white people, versus another writer who is saying what they want to say, it's likely that second product is going to be better than that first one, right? And so, but that, so it's I think it's much more complicated, and I think that's why I wanted to start with, we actually don't have data that actually definitively proves that if people of color assimilate, they will, quote, do economically better, because there's a cost to assimilation. The cost is you not putting forth your best self.
Yes. Are you aware of any evidence or thought, or do you have any thoughts about children who live on military bases and segregated by military status and not by color, having any more advantage? I'm sorry, I don't think I'm getting this right. Is there evidence or thoughts about children who live on military bases and segregated by military status and not by color have more of an advantage of being anti-racist?
I'm not familiar with any evidence that demonstrates that. Although what I would suspect, if we think about it based on the existing evidence, we know, I think that sort of military bases are more heterogeneous than other parts of the nation. And so thereby, we do know that children who are born in more heterogeneous environments are are in some cases more likely to express anti-racist ideas. So that could be the case, but I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, how do you feel about the habit of using vanilla words like multicultural or diverse, or abbreviating diversity, equity, inclusion as DEI? Vanilla meaning avoidant or safe.
So I actually think that we should not, if we want to talk about anti-racism, if we want to talk about racism, we should just say that and not necessarily use those types of words. If we want to talk about a school being racially diverse, we should use that term. And so indeed, I think you do have people not wanting to use the R word, racist or racism, and instead use terms that they feel are more acceptable.
Yeah. In your study, what is it about our history, or maybe this is an obvious question, but from your perspective, why is the R word a bad word?
So I think that, well, first, the first group of people to define the term racist and to assign it to a particular group, that really emerged in the 1940s. And the group that was assigned as racist were eugenicists. And eugenicists, of course, in the United States were responsible for the sterilization, of thousands of Black and brown and poor and disabled women. Of course, the eugenicists were responsible for the Holocaust. So you're talking about some of the most bad, evil, quote, people, or who engaged in some of the most horrific acts, of the last century. So then when you fast forward to now, to the fact that you literally have white nationalists and white supremacist organizations who are going around and recruiting particularly white people by saying things like racist isn't a descriptive term. Racist is a pejorative term. it's the equivalent of saying, I don't like you. And I'm quoting Richard Spencer directly, the sort of pioneer of the alt-right movement. And so people imagine that when you describe a person as racist, you're trying to hurt and attack them. And that racist is an evil, horrible person, and you have this bad, evil person tattooed on your forehead forever. So that's why people are like, no, 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 that's not me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we covered a lot of big topics today, and one of your tweets from 2019 really sums it up for me. You said racism, the R word, racism is death, anti-racism is life. And as Birth to Five champions, policies that breathe life and opportunity is everything. So I leave the audience with that short summary of all the topics that we've offered today. A plug for your podcast, Be Anti-Racist, period. I love that there's a period after it. It was just announced this week, so tune in for that. Thank you for being a champion of life, of anti-racist ideas and policies, and for inspiring us to do the same. I offer any closing, do you have any closing words for us?
Well, the only thing is that my daughter actually just turned 5 years old. And so hopefully this time next year, I know y'all won't be champions for her anymore, because there's a lot of K to 5-year-olds or birth to 5-year-olds you have to champion. But yeah, we're excited because she just turned 5.
Is she going to kindergarten in the fall?
Yes.
Okay, well, she's still in our love.
Okay, all right, good.
That transition is a really important time period. Thank you, Dr. Kendi, for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you so much for joining us. Wow, I would like to ask everyone to join me in giving a virtual round of applause to Dr. Kendi and Sophia. Thank you both for leading us in such a powerful discussion on racism, racial justice, anti-racism. As I'm thinking about your comments, I just want to say, I'm sorry your daughter's just turned 5, because we're where it's at, Dr. Kendi. We're gonna get this done. This field, I'm so inspired. I'm always inspired when I hear you speak, when I read your words, but we must do this. It's now, and it is on us. And we pledge that to you, and we are again just so deeply appreciative for your leadership, for leading us, and for respecting our field, and for trusting and hoping with us that we will do this. So let this discussion further encourage us to consider new ways we can be anti-racist ourselves, adopt anti-racist policies for our organizations, our state, our country. Additionally, as we close out today, thank you for all your dedication to supporting young children and families across the state and across the country. I know people hail from every point across North Carolina, but also outside of North Carolina, and we're grateful to you all. I want to give you a huge thank you to the presenters who led wonderful discussions on so many important topics these past few days, for your expertise and your thought leadership. We can make the early childhood system stronger for all. Of course, our conference would not be possible without our sponsors, who know the importance of investing in early childhood and in the early childhood field and sector. So thank you all. And finally, I want to say a huge thanks to my colleagues at the North Carolina Partnership for Children for all your work, folks who volunteered, who aren't on our comms and event planning, certainly to our comms and event planning, our IT folks across the organization. Thank you for your work to pull off such a successful conference. And let me remind everyone that while the first 4 days of the 2021 Smart Start Conference are over, we still have additional feature panels taking place throughout the month of May. And next Thursday, we have a featured session addressing challenges in rural communities. And we have panelists including one of our own, Magda Belai with the Halifax Warren Smart Start, Todd Brantley of the Rural Center, my good friend Kari Garvin of Head Start and Save the Children, Seth Sagling of the Rural Opportunity Institute. And I can't wait to see all of you there. And additional featured sessions are coming, and they'll focus on the policy landscape for early childhood at both state and federal levels, and explore tools and strategies to support the early care and education workforce. And please watch for additional information about the sessions, general conference updates on our website, coming at you on social media as well. And once again, on behalf of the North Carolina Partnership for Children and the entire Smart Start Network, thank you for joining us for this 2021 Smart Start Conference. It was so exciting to reconnect with partners and to meet new leaders. And I hope to see you all in person next year. I can't wait to see each of you and to keep working with you to advance early childhood so that each child in every community has a brighter future. And I know that we can do this. Thank you all so much, and take good care.